Hello friends, the discussion today is going to be on rights issues and the topic for today is going to be refugee policy in India. अब ये जो refugee policy in India का topic है ये मैंने इसलिए उठाया because not only there is a war going on in Ukraine but अभी if you see currently there's an economic crisis happening in Sri Lanka where people have already started trickling into the Indian borders. वो अभी से Indian borders में आने लगे हैं and इसकी वजह से the Indian media as well as the international media have again started asking the same question they do every single time something like this happens, be it the Rohingya issue or the Taliban Afghanistan issue, that why does India not have a domestic refugee policy? Now, and isi mein they compound another question and ask why is India not a signatory to the 1951 Convention on Refugees or the 67 Protocol on Refugees? Now, this question is like all important, but at the same time, from a perspective of a aspirant who's going to give the 2022 prelims, UPSC can easily ask a question regarding the definition of refugee. What entails a refugee? वो ये भी पूछ सकते हैं कि इकोनॉमिक माइग्रेंट रेफ्यूजी होता है कि नहीं, एक इंटरनली डिस्प्लेस्ड पर्सन रेफ्यूजी होता है कि नहीं, एंड व्हाट आर द डिफरेंट क्राइटेरियाज अंडर विच a refugee can be defined. So these are the questions that we are going to tackle today and the next class on refugee policy in India. So let's get right back into our class. Now, if you look at the data given to us by the United Nations Refugee Agency, you would see that they talk very categorically about forcibly displaced people worldwide. And this forcibly displaced people worldwide is being divided into three categories here. First is 48 million people who are internally displaced people, right? Then you have 26.6 million of refugees and about 4.4 million of asylum seekers. Now keep this in mind that the data is from June 2021, so it does not account the Ukrainian war and any other event that happened post that. Now, this matrix already tells you that there is a good differentiation between internally displaced people, refugees, as well as asylum seekers. Now, further moving on to the statistics, you'll find a very important fact here. And this is very important from the perspective of mains as well as prelims, that 86% of these refugees, or in fact 86% of the internally displaced 84 million people are hosted in developing countries. तो ये जो 14% हमारे developed countries who make such a hue and cry about refugee rights and issues, they only bear 14% of the burden, and 86% of the burden comes down to developing countries, out of which 73% are hosted in neighboring countries, right? If you look here, you see the major sources of countries from where these forcibly displaced people are originating are Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, and South Sudan, alongside Myanmar. Now, you'd see that the major host of the countries are what? Neighboring countries. They are neighboring countries to the countries where the main source of ailment lies. So, for example, from Syria, people are coming to Turkey. From Venezuela, people are going to Colombia. From Afghanistan, people have come down to Pakistan. And from South Sudan, they have come to Uganda. The only outlier here being Germany, because Germany, they had this taking in 1 million refugees policy by Angela Merkel. So that's the reason why they have this population here. But a good way of seeing this is that all the countries where all these refugees are originating from, jahan se bhi ye refugees aa rahe hain, the place where they end up are the neighboring countries. Same thing is happening in Ukraine, where you would see that most of this exodus of Ukrainian population, जितने भी वॉर की वजह से यूक्रेन के लोग निकल रहे हैं, चाहे पैदल या whatever means of travel they are adopting to, they are going to the Polish borders, to the Poland borders, right? And Poland is now becoming the biggest hub of the Ukrainian migrants. So, in this case, it's very important for us to notice that 86% of these displaced people are being hosted in developing countries. Right, so in today's discussion, what we are going to cover is the definition of refugee, right? Definition of refugee. From there, we will move on to the codification of the refugee law. And how did it all begin? How did League of Nations go towards the international refugee organization and lead to the creation of United Nations for a High Commission for Refugees. And then in tomorrow's and day after tomorrow's class, we will talk about India's policy on refugees and India's constitutional as well as judicial position on refugees. Right? So let's begin today's class by defining what refugees mean. Now, refugee, अगर हम मोटा माटी देखें तो it could be anyone who's fleeing a socio-economic conflict and there is some fear of prosecution happening in the country. But in international law, हमारे international law में, it has a very specific and a narrow definition, which says the Article 1A subclause 2 talks about a refugee is someone who, owing to well-founded fear of being prosecuted for reasons of race and religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or a political opinion, is outside, a very important term here, outside the country of his nationality and is unable or owing to such fear is unwilling to avail himself the protection of that country is known as a refugee. Now, we are going to break down this whole definition because this is where UPSC will play its game. UPSC will ask you a definition and this is where they'll alter it. So we need to have a very clear understanding of how they are defining refugees, right? So the first conversation we are going to have is about well-founded fear. ये well-founded fear क्या होता है? Now, according to the convention, they say that a well-founded fear can be both subjective as well as objective. In subjectivity of well-founded fear, it means the experience, the perception, and the emotions or emotional stress that the refugee feels, right? Because how the refugee feels is on the refugee, right? And they might feel threatened for some reason or the other, and there is no way you can go ahead and justify them feeling threatened or not. But the objective criteria of this is the status in the country of origin, which means what is happening in the country. Is it actually leading to exodus of these people to go outside the country for their own safety, right? So this is well-founded fear. Well-founded fear is the person has a fear to their life, either have been a victim, they have been a victim of prosecution or are in the risk of being prosecuted, which is leading to them feeling emotionally distressed, have an experience of emotional distress or have a perception of emotional distress, and the state itself or the country of origin itself is facing some distress. That talks about well-founded fear. उसके बाद हमारा अगला term है prosecuted. What does prosecuted mean? Prosecuted means that the government is prosecuting or punishing these people, right? Now यहाँ पे अब हम ये नहीं बोल सकते कि कल मैं गया और मैंने किसी की गाड़ी ठोक दी और मेरे को 5,000 रुपीज़ का फाइन मांगा और इसकी वजह से मैंने बोला I am being prosecuted. No, this is the key criteria here is that the prosecution is beyond human rights or it's in violation of human rights, right? So prosecution by the government, which is excessive punishment, which goes beyond human rights, can be considered as a ground of prosecution under the definition of refugee. Then comes these three terms: race, religion, and nationality. A good example of all these three, let's talk about race. For race, a good example here would be in South Africa, when because of the apartheid regime, when African blacks were being prosecuted, right? That was a race issue. Similarly, in a religion issue would be when it could be, in fact, another good example here for the race issue would be in Uganda. In Uganda, when during the Idi Amin's regime in 1972, a lot of Ugandans were being prosecuted. a lot of Ugandans there were being prosecuted, right? Similarly, religion and nationality, the examples are galore. For example, in religion, you would see that there was a time when Talibanis were trying to convert the Sikh people there into their Islam, and if they were not agreeing to it, they were going ahead and killing them. Similar thing happened with Baha'is in Iran, where the Baha'is were being prosecuted. Baha'is are the largest minority group in Iran, right? And they were being prosecuted there because of their own religion, and this led to them fleeing away from Iran. So this is another reason for prosecution because of religion. Then nationality, a good example here would be, I mean, you can talk about Rohingya here. Rohingya was a mix of both ethnicity as well as nationality, where the nation of Myanmar went ahead and made them stateless. They called them stateless people. They took away their nationality, right? Now comes membership of a particular social group. Membership of a particular social group. What does this mean? Now, membership of a particular social group can be defined by the country of origin in any way possible, right? It could be defined as belonging to a particular family, belonging to a particular trade union, belonging to a particular social organization, belonging to a particular gender, sexual orientation, or caste. Now, these can be part of the particular social group. In fact, another interesting thing to notice here was the executive committee of UNHCR, which is also known as the EXCOM. They said that in their observation of all the refugees that are fleeing different countries, a large chunk of them are women and children, and these women and children are being specifically prosecuted by certain groups, be it terrorist groups or be it any other religio-political group. They are being prosecuted particularly because of their gender, and that itself includes them into particular social group wala category, right? And then finally we come to political opinion. Now, political opinion again could, a good example here would be the case of Tibetans. The Tibetans, they associated themselves to belong to an autonomous region, but China as a government does not ascribe there to be any autonomous region per se, right? So they started prosecuting these Tibetans because of this political opinion. Similar thing can happen. This thing of political opinion can be like depending on the country of origin. वो किसी के ऊपर भी ये चीज़ थोक सकते हैं, be it on the basis of sedition or on the basis of anything that is contrary to their national security and public order, right? So the race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, and political opinion are important terms because they define how they are being prosecuted, how these refugees are prosecuted, and they come as an inclusion clause. Inclusion clause for UNHCR to include these people into the category of refugee. Now, इसमें एक और word जो है वो है outside, and I'll tell you why the word outside has such an important meaning to it. Because when we look into the type of people who are migrating away from a country, who are escaping a country or leaving a country, this can be classified into many small different categories, right? Like a person can be fleeing their country because of economic crisis. Right? They can be fleeing a country, or they can be coming out of a country because of better job opportunities. They can be coming out of a country because they want better education. Right? Now, in the case of someone who's fleeing because of an economic crisis, they are an economic migrant. Does the UNHCR recognize them as refugees? And the answer here is no. UNHCR कहता है कि अगर एक country में economic crisis हो रहा है, then that economic crisis is impacting the whole population. And because it is impacting the whole population, a single individual is not being prosecuted because of it. इसीलिए अगर इकोनॉमिक क्राइसिस की वजह से कोई अगर एक कंट्री से दूसरी कंट्री में आ रहा है, स्पेशली इन द केस ऑफ श्रीलंका, इफ यू सी, इफ अ श्रीलंकन family is coming because of economic distress into India, they are themselves not regarded as refugee. And yahi pe the problem is, a lot of these news media channels or a lot of these compilations or papers will call this a refugee transit between Sri Lanka and India, which is not. Even UNHCR doesn't recognize them as proper refugees. They don't. These are just economic migrants, right? Now, what happens in the case of job opportunity or education? Now, as long as someone is traveling from one country to another country with valid documents, with valid visa, with an entry permit, they are not going to be recorded as refugees. But there is a very, very tricky case here. This case is called Refugee Surplace. Now, refugee surplace is a category where if a person has entered another country with a valid travel document, where while entering the country they were not being prosecuted, while entering this new country, for example, if there is student Y, a student from a country Y is going to a country Z, right, for let's say education purposes, he's going to there for education purposes, and this student he belongs to a particular ethnic category or a particular religious group. Now, while he was there in country Z, a war breaks out in country Y, and this war is being particularly a war that is particularly targeted against the ethnic group to which this student belongs. Now, in this case, the student might ये जो स्टूडेंट है ये हमको आके बोलेगा कि नहीं, आई हैव ऑल द कंडीशंस दैट आर रिक्वायर्ड फॉर मी टू बी ट्रीटेड एज अ रेफ्यूजी बिकॉज आई डोंट वांट टू गो बैक टू द कंट्री, बिकॉज अगर मैं वहाँ पे वापस गया तो मुझे मार देंगे. एंड बिकॉज ऑफ दिस पर्सन विल बी रिगार्डेड और गिवन रिवॉर्डेड एज अ रेफ्यूजी, विल बी गिवन द रेफ्यूजी स्टेटस. एंड दिस इज व्हाट रेफ्यूजी सरप्लेस मीन्स. Refugee surplace means when one person has come to another country without the reason of prosecution, but now because of certain circumstances in the country of origin, them going back is not possible. They are regarded as refugee surplace, right? So now we spoke about the let's talk about the case where if a person is displaced but the person is inside the country. These people are known as internally displaced person. These people are known as internally displaced person. As we saw in the metric, in the United Nations refugee metric that we saw in the beginning of the class, you would see that there were 48 million people who were refugees, who were internally displaced people, right? 48 million people who are internally displaced. Now, what does the term internally displaced mean? And why is it categorically different from refugee? Here, the name itself gives you the full information. It means internally displaced. Internally means inside the country of origin. Right? They are inside the country of origin from where they are being displaced from. Displaced means they had to leave their home. अपना घर छोड़ना पड़ा, be it for economic reasons, be it for disasters, be it for any internal war or conflict breaking out. They, for whatever reason, had to go out from their own homes, leave their own homes now and travel, but travel inside their own borders. Now, in this case, the UNHCR does not regard them as refugees. In fact, the distinction of IDP, which is internally displaced people, is just a paper term. It is just a paper term. The UNHCR, not the UNHCR, neither any other organizations give them any specific status just because they have been displaced internally, right? So that's the case with internally displaced person. Then we have what we call an asylum seeker, right? An asylum seeker. Now, what is an asylum seeker? An asylum seeker is a person who has crossed the border into another country from the country of origin where he was being prosecuted, and there he is seeking asylum and has not been accorded the status of a refugee yet. So, let's take an example here. A good example here would be, say, someone belongs to Mariupol. Mariupol is a city in Ukraine which was being attacked by Russia. Now, the person who was there in Mariupol had to walk all the way to the border, or the Polish border, the border between Ukraine and Poland. Now, while walking from Mariupol to the Polish border, this person was regarded as an internally displaced person. This person was regarded as an internally displaced person. Now, the moment they crossed to the border of Poland and they were seeking refuge, they were seeking an asylum, they were seeking a home, they were seeking assistance, be it medical or food or any other assistance, they were regarded as asylum seekers. And when the state, this is something that we'll talk about right here in refugee status determination, that who determines a refugee, right? Who accords them the status of refugee. But the moment the state recognizes them as a refugee, that's where they become refugees. So there's this whole pathway from an internally displaced person to an asylum seeker, and then finally becoming a refugee, right? Now, why? Another question that UPSC can ask you here, and this is a very important question, is that the definition says that owing to well-founded fear of being prosecuted, and this prosecution is being done by a government. But what if this prosecution is being done by a non-state agent? What if this prosecution is being done by a terrorist organization or is being done by a drug cartel, right? In that case, can you escape out of the country and still be regarded as a person who is being prosecuted? Well, the answer is yes, in case where the government itself is not according you protection against such an organization. It could be a case where the government itself is colluding with that organization. For example, right now the situation in Afghanistan is such कि यहाँ पे Afghanistan में जो government है, it's also being run by Taliban, and all the other atrocities that are being committed are also being committed by Taliban. So if there's a woman there in Afghanistan, in Kabul, who is facing atrocities by Taliban, but not directly by the government, and here they go and approach the government, which is again run by Taliban, and the government does not want to accord any help to this person can escape to the bordering countries, can go to any of the bordering countries and claim the refugee status, because they are still being prosecuted and the state itself does not want to accord them any protection against such prosecution. Clear? Okay, so now why is this whole thing important? What is the main power that the status of refugee grants a person who's seeking asylum? The main power is this, Article 33. The main power is Article 33. The Article 33 talks about non-refoulement. Non-refoulement means that you cannot, the person who's coming from the country of origin where they're being prosecuted, आप इनको वापस नहीं भेज सकते. And that is exactly what the non-refoulement would say. It says that no contracting state. Now, a contracting state is a state that is receiving the people, the state that is receiving these refugees into their borders. No contracting state shall expel or return a refoul a refugee in any manner whatsoever, to the frontiers of territories where his life or freedom would be threatened on account of his race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or public opinion. Now, this is the most powerful instrument of the UNHCR or the Refugee Convention, that a person who's being prosecuted is being accorded international protection and cannot be compelled to return to the place from where they were being prosecuted, right? Now, all these criteria that we saw above, the criteria that spoke about them being prosecuted because of all these reasons, are called inclusion criteria. These are the criteria that when a state has to determine the refugee status, when they have to do the RSD, which is the refugee status determination, they would look into. Okay, let's cover RSD right here itself. Now, RSD is the refugee status determination happens by the state. The state gives refugee status, which is helped by the criteria of UNHCR. The state is the state in which the refugee has been seeking asylum. वो जिस country में border cross करके आए हैं, that country itself is going to accord the status of a refugee, right? And that is being guided by the Convention of UNHCR. Now, there are two cases here. One case is where there is the country in which the person has gone to is signatory to the 1951 Convention or the 67 Protocol, or in a case where it is not, then it's UNHCR. In a case where the state where the refugee has gone is not signatory to the convention, in that case, the UNHCR will give the status of a refugee to that person who's seeking asylum. Clear? Completely clear? So, now all these criterias were the inclusion criterias, the prosecution criterias based on race, religion, nationality, particular social group or political opinion. These are inclusion criterias. Because we have inclusion criterias, at the same time there are exclusion criterias, criterias which doesn't allow a person to be counted as a refugee. And in this case, there are three major exclusion criterias. The first criteria is if there is already an existing UN body. There is already an existing UN body that provides certain protection to the refugees. A good example here is United Nations agency that is doing this refugee work in Palestine. In Palestine, there's the United Nations organization which is doing refugee work in Palestine near the Far East, is an organization that is providing particularly to the Palestinian refugees, and these refugees will not be considered under the UNHCR. These refugees will not be considered refugees under UNHCR. The next exclusion criteria is if the refugee, the person who is seeking refuge, does not require, they don't need it, which means that the country that they have gone to, the country where they have reached, that country have already accorded them all the protection, all the benefits that a normal citizen would get, barring the citizenship. All the normal, be it insurance, be it employment, be it regularization of their income, everything has been accorded to them. In this case, they don't require the status of a refugee. And the last one for exclusion criteria is when they don't deserve. They don't deserve the refugee status. When does this happen? This happens when the person who's seeking refuge has committed crimes against humanity, has committed war crimes, has committed atrocities, or is in general in violation of the rights that are being set by UN. In this case, this person will not be accorded because they don't deserve the protection of being a refugee, right? So these were the exclusion criteria. The definition gives us the inclusion criteria of refugees, and these three are the exclusion criteria of a refugee. Now this gives us a holistic picture of what a refugee is. A refugee is a person who has a well-founded fear of being prosecuted because of all these reasons that we mentioned. There could be the internally displaced person. An internally displaced person is not a refugee. An economic migrant itself cannot be a refugee. And at the same time, an asylum seeker is also not a refugee. Refugee is only a person who's been accorded the status of a refugee under the state law or under UNHCR in case where the state itself is not a signatory to the 1951 convention, right? Now, let's move on to the origin of the Refugee Convention. This is a very important topic from both the mains as well as the prelims perspective. Because the Refugee Convention right now, the name that we throw every single time when the Refugee Convention is spoken about is the 1951 Convention or the 1967 Protocol. But these were not the origin of this convention. The convention on refugees started with League of Nations. And why did this happen? Because League of Nations came right after World War I. League of Nations came right after World War I when there were not only prisoners of war, but there were also a lot of people who were being displaced all over Europe. And that's when when League of Nations as an organization was created, there was a person by the name of Fridtjof Nansen. Fridtjof Nansen was the key or the person who pioneered the Refugee Convention. Mr. Nansen took four major projects under him as the first UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and two before that. One of the things that he did was he was very instrumental in repatriation of about 500,000 prisoners of war, especially coming from the Southern Europe and USSR. Then he was also instrumental in the population exchange program that happened after there was a civil war breakout between Greece and Turkey. And this same person, Mr. Nansen, was the person who propagated the concept of a Nansen passport. What is a Nansen passport? Now, Nansen said that a lot of people who are fleeing such war-torn areas or are fleeing because of such an emergency or are being prosecuted and fleeing, a lot of time these people do not have documents that identify them. या तो इनके पास इंटरनेशनली रिकग्नाइज्ड आइडेंटिटी डॉक्यूमेंट्स नहीं है, या तो ट्रैवल डॉक्यूमेंट्स नहीं है, या तो सेल्फ रिकग्निशन और सेल्फ आइडेंटिटी डॉक्यूमेंट्स नहीं है. इसकी वजह से जस्ट बिकॉज दे डोंट हैव डॉक्यूमेंट्स, दीज पीपल कैन नॉट बी इनवैलिडेटेड. इसी के लिए there was a Nansen passport that was created, which basically gave these people an internationally recognized identity. And this Nansen passport was the precursor to all the refugee documents that we have these days. All the refugee forms and documents and travel documents that are being made these days came from the Nansen passport, right? So right after League of Nations was formed and all these repatriation of the prisoners of war as well as people who were displaced was happening, and as this went forward, as other nations joined in, they started looking not only into repatriation but also the settlement, the economic settlement for these refugees, the regularization of these refugees, and most importantly, exclusion of them being compelled to return to their country of origin if there is a threat to them. And while doing this, we enter an era where countries are again about to fight the World War II. Now, remember, during this phase, Fridtjof Nansen already won a Nobel Peace Prize for repatriation of refugees, and he went ahead and created a lot more legislations which gave the backbone to the organization that came right after World War II, which was UN, and with UN, it was the International Refugee Organization that was made by UN. Now, after the World War II, UN recognized that not only do we have to deal with the repatriation of the people who were displaced during World War I, so they took up all the things that were happening in post World War I in League of Nations. यही चीज़ इनको करना था World War II के बाद, where they had a huge number of people now who are being already displaced, right? And for that, for dealing with particularly these two displacements, one from the World War II and the people who are already being displaced in World War I, as well as the World War II, they created an organization called the International Refugee Organization. This International Refugee Organization, the main two things it wanted to do was provide international protection to these refugees and also make sure that these refugees are not being forced or not being compelled to return to the country where they are facing prosecution. That has always been the key agenda. This was the creation or the beginnings of the non-refoulement, right? And then during the first session in 1946, UN recognizes the duty it has towards refugee. In its first session only, they spoke about refugees and displacement of people that happened because of both the world wars, right? And there, abhi tak, the main objective for refugees, especially from these international organizations, was repatriation of them. That is, to make sure they can go back to their old countries, they can settle there, to fund their repatriation, they're going back to their own countries. But now, as the World War II ended, and we know the whole Cold War tension started beginning, and we had a lot of other political turmoil happening all over Europe as well as other countries, they recognized that maybe repatriation is not the way to go about it. They recognize that we might be in a situation where we have to resettle these refugees right in the country where they have fled to, right? The country, the contracting state that they have come to. So in this case, they for the first time spoke about resettlement assimilation due to valid objections. And guess what these valid objections were? These valid objections were the well-founded fear of being prosecuted because of race, religion, nationality, particular social group, or public political opinion, right? So this was the precursor to the definition of refugee that we are using today. And after this 1946 and slowly coming to 1951, we had that the UN create a dedicated office which was to be known as the United Nations High Commission for Refugees to set minimum standards. And it set two minimum standards. The basic minimum standards was that a person who is a refugee, who has entered another country, should at least be treated on par as an alien for that country. Right? They should be treated on par as an alien. And further, that was the minimum standard, to be treated as an alien. But the main goal, the main purpose of UNHCR was going to be 1. International protection. And second, assimilation. Assimilation, which means to help the government assimilate all these refugees into their own society and have them get a new home. अब जब initially इस time पे around 1946-1951 वाला phase, we were dealing with the situation of World War II, where most of the focus was going into the European countries. Most of the focus was regarding people who were displaced because of the World War II. And because of that, when the 1951 convention came, it had a cutoff date. The cutoff date was 1st January 1951. The cutoff date was 1st January 1951. What this meant was, according to the convention, any person who has been displaced because of events preceding 1st January 1951 would be accorded the refugee status, right? On top of that, there was another geographical limitation placed on it. This was the temporal limitation, which was the 1st January 1951, right? And the geographical limitation was that all the events that were occurring in Europe, people who were displaced by the events occurring in Europe till the 1st January of 1951 would be accorded the status of refugee. And because this was mostly European countries, UNHCR wanted the economic or the material burden to be borne by the host country of the refugee. But by the time we reach 1967, UN recognizes that आसपास अभी जो वॉर वाला सिचुएशन चल रहा है, आसपास जो ये कोल्ड वॉर वाला सिचुएशन चल रहा है, there are a lot more refugees around the world who have been facing the same persecution. Then why are they being treated differently? Why is there a distinction? When we talk about human rights so highly, then why is a distinction between a refugee who came before 1951, 1st January 1951, and a refugee who came after 1951? A refugee who does not belong to a European country and a refugee who does belong to a European country. And that's why, because of this distinction, we had the 1967 protocol. What the protocol did was it removed these two distinctions. It removed these two limitations. Now, there was no limitation to who can be called a refugee based on the time when they had to flee the country. And that became our 1951 convention and 1967 protocol. Right? Now, the curious case here is that India is not a signatory to either 1951 convention or the 67 protocol. And yet, India has always had asylum seekers come to India, be it from the partition in 1947, be it the Bangladesh war in 1971, be it the civil unrest in Sri Lanka, or the Tibetan crisis that happened in China. So India has always given asylum without even being part of the conventions, right? So this is a very interesting part. And on top of that, even though India does not ascribe to the non-refoulement that has been given, the non-refoulement that has been given in the 1951 convention, it is still part of other international organizations like or treaties like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the United Nations Convention Against Torture or the ICCPR, which explicitly or implicitly talks about non-refoulement. It is a part of these organizations. They talk about non-refoulement. India does agree with the non-refoulement that these organizations talk about, and yet is not part of the non-refoulement that is under 1951 Convention or the 1967 Protocol. Right? That's the curious case. And that is the case that we will discuss later on when we take the next class on Indian laws, Indian legislations, and Indian policies, and India's own policy stand when it comes to refugees. I hope you enjoyed this class. Make sure you go back, revisit, reread this class, pick up the speed on it, and make sure this should be taken as a class where you have a good understanding of what refugee is. So that tomorrow when UPSC asks you a question, you have a very clear understanding and you get the marks that you deserve. I am Arnav Pote, and I'll see you in the next class. Thank you.